I'm going to be talking to you about various projects we've been doing about rural communities. So we're talking about rural communities, and the reason they're marginalised is because they're in quite marginal rural locations. For the most part, they don't get broadband and very limited internet, as Helen mentioned in her talk. So quite often the way to provide public services in those remote locations is seen as through communities working for themselves, as community mobilisation, as community empowerment. And this has been part of the public policy discourse to encourage communities to just do things for themselves. So I think it's been part of the discourse generally, but it's been particularly the case in rural communities where lots of services are just not available unless people provide them themselves or mobilise in some way. So the background to this project is that there's a lack of broadband in rural areas, and rural areas are sidelined in UK programmes. We're always hearing about the provision of broadband in the UK. We're going to be the best in Europe, best in the world, all that sort of thing. But there's 5% of places that don't get broadband provision, and mostly they're in rural areas. And sometimes they're not all that rural even, but the remote rural areas have a particular problem. Now, a lot of the digital initiatives tend to assume that you create a digital initiative, you put everybody online, and then life gets better. It must be good. Life gets better. So it's assumed it's better for business, it's better for community cohesion, and so on. Now, our studies show that it's not that simple. Actually, there's lots of different ways in which communities can use internet connectivity when they get it, and that's not always very predictable. You can't say this will happen when you introduce this. But I'm going to be talking here about the ways in which things are introduced and then how they're used by communities. So community empowerment has become a very popular part of policy discourse, which I shall show you in a minute. And the idea is that you empower local communities, but in conditions of local authority cuts. So you empower communities, and there's a lot of discussion about this, that local authorities have more power. They've got more power but less money. So, and part of the devolution discourse is also about that, about how you give power to regions, to areas, but at the same time cut the funds. So, so it's a kind of rather contradictory sort of set of policies. And what tends to happen is that funding is provided for local initiatives to take place. So it's not that we give you the money, it's you have to apply. So it means you have to form a committee, you have to find some associations, you've got to find someone who can write the application forms, and then they can apply for money. And quite often there's little pots of money all around the place, from the European Union, from local government, in our case from the Scottish government, and also in Scotland from wind farms. So you can apply for money from wind farms, for example, but somebody has to apply, somebody has to know it's there, somebody has to organise to actually get it, which isn't necessarily straightforward. So lots of communities don't do it because they don't know about it, they haven't got anyone who can sort of mobilise those kinds of activities to actually do it. So participation in public services, which is what we're all supposed to encourage, appears to enable citizens to have a say, but represents a kind of neoliberal governmentality, because the parameters are controlled by the government itself. So it wants people to take responsibility, but only in certain ways and only within certain parameters. And the Big Society initiative has already been discussed here. There's Etzioni's concept of community power, which was talked about yesterday, which fits into this framework. It's a bit different in Scotland because many of these remote communities never had anything anyway, so if they want to get anything they've got to mobilise to do it themselves, and some of them do, some of them don't. The good thing about it is failure can be blamed on the communities. You didn't do it, you don't get it. There's all this money in wind farms, you don't apply for it, okay, we spend it on something else, or it sits there somewhere. So the failure of community mobilisation can be seen as a reason for not having these various kinds of services. And many communities do not respond. So Sarah Skerrett, for example, has written a paper about people not responding to the EU Leader programme, which is in fact most communities. The ones I'm going to talk about are the ones that did respond, but lots of communities just don't respond, nothing happens, they don't get any services, and they're not empowered, I suppose. So the policy discourses. I looked through a few policy documents to try to find some examples for you here. So in the Community Empowerment Act, Scotland, 2015, they say when people have greater control of their future, they are more engaged and able to tackle barriers to making their communities wealthier and fairer. And the Community Empowerment Act, Scotland, is mainly concerned with communities being empowered to buy land and transfer assets like village halls or post offices and things to the communities. But the buying land is quite important in a Scottish context because there's big landed estates where people traditionally didn't own their own environment. So they're able to buy the land and their own environment if they can mobilise as communities. So it's going back to, I think, Leah's point earlier on about, you know, how you stimulate that kind of community activism and whether it takes place. Another two examples I found here from the LEADER programme. So lots of these rural initiatives are funded by something called LEADER, and I won't tell you what that stands for because it's in French, so I won't inflict my poor French on you. But basically the LEADER's been replaced by something called community-led local development, and it aims again to empower local communities through partnerships to take action to help improve their areas. And the final example is from the World Health Organization, where again this community empowerment discourse has been very influential in saying that's how policy should be delivered and how aid should be delivered. I'm actually not against the idea of community empowerment. I just think it's ambivalent in the current funding context, as I hope I shall demonstrate. So this study is based on 4 case studies of various sizes and project lengths of remote communities, 4 remote communities, participant observation at community events, semi-structured interviews with community leaders and key informants, and also with various community members, and analysis of online presence of each of these communities online, both on Google and on Facebook. So the first example is Uplands Village. This was in the Pennines. It's our only English case study actually. It's a rural town in northern England which started to transform itself into a tourist destination and an attractive place to live. But nevertheless it's quite run down. There's lots of benefits claimants because people move there because of the bedroom tax. They have to leave the houses that they were in. So they go to places where there's a lot of rundown cheap property available, like this place. So they've actually had an influx of welfare claimants in this particular town. They set up a pioneering broadband social enterprise, which is seen as a kind of exemplar model for other places as well. And they set up this broadband enterprise by getting cooperative shares from the community, but also by applying for various types of funding. I don't think you get wind farm funding in England, but anyway, they got various types of funding. And then they set up the fibre optic cable, but it took them a long time to get it into place. So they've only just started providing fibre optic services to people in the community now, and that's sort of like many years after the project started because of intermittent funding. And that's the problem with a lot of these projects. They get intermittent funding, people leave, the person who set it all up then goes, or they get ill or something. So it just, you know, these kind of initiatives come and go, and there's a kind of ebb and flux about them. So that one took a long time to get off the ground, and now it's partially privatised. They privatised some aspects of the community broadband because it turned out that the community couldn't actually, they couldn't be there 24 hours to deal with people's problems and things. They just privatised that service to another organisation. They set up a community website. The community websites have been quite important in these communities, and welfare claimants were particularly pleased about it because they have to travel, I think it was 2 hours on the bus to Carlisle, and now they cut the bus service to sign on, so they can sign on using this fibre optic. So that was actually rather good for them, actually the ones that were able to access it anyway. And there are many social enterprises in this area. The second village is called Commuter Village. It's near Aberdeen. It's a mixture of farmers and commuters, characterised by lots of new buildings. And the social enterprise was set up by one particular individual. He was an engineer in the oil industry, because most of the people work in the oil industry. And he was fed up with the poor services, internet services. So he set up a social enterprise and mobilised people and accessed funding like LEADER and so on to provide broadband services for that village. It's very fragile because it depends on this one guy, and when he gets sick, nothing happens. So it's a social enterprise that really depends on one person. But people are quite pleased about this broadband services, but they don't use it for setting up community websites like the first place I talked about. They use it mainly for streaming films, for talking to their friends, and for going shopping. So it's kind of seen as a private service, and there's some Facebook groups, but not very many. So we couldn't find much online presence to do with this community, but that doesn't mean people weren't online. They're online, but in their sort of more private capacity, and also working at home and doing remote working. The third one is Island Village. That's what you more think about Scotland, don't you? So it only has 80 permanent residents, and you can only get there on a boat or a ferry. The main resources come from tourism and management of the local estate, and they actually are one of the communities that bought their land under this community. There's an earlier act that made it possible for Act of Parliament made it possible for communities in Scotland to buy their land. So this is one of the communities that actually did buy their land. So they bought the previous estate that they were living on. So most of the houses are owned, some of them are privately owned, but a lot of them are owned by this community trust, which is what bought out the estate. They set up a regional social enterprise along with other small islands in the region, and a broadband network in 2012. Now that picture, which isn't a very good one, shows the mast which they put up themselves on a high point in order to capture the broadband network. So they have actually very good broadband now in that area, but it was set up fairly recently. And it made a big difference to their online presence. So in 2013, when we started doing this research, there wasn't much online presence for this community at all. And in 2015, there was a big online presence. So lots of the businesses used it. Lots of the other kinds of organisations that were there were mainly Facebook ones. So they had Facebook, walking groups or meetings and things, which they organised through these Facebook pages. So a huge explosion of Facebook pages after that was set up. And the final example is Peninsula Village, and this is a place at the sort of end of a peninsula in Scotland, and there had been an influx of bohemian middle-class people, I call them that, since the 1980s, that helped to restore the fishing village into more sort of desirable residences. And as part of that, one of the kind of movers and shakers, they've got quite a few movers and shakers in this community, they've got lots of community leadership, and I think that's why it works so well. But one of the people who moved there in the 1990s set up a for-benefit company. So it wasn't just a private company to make profits for the company. It was a company that was meant to help the community and provide a service for the community. And I was had some difficulty characterising this, but I read a paper recently by Rhonda Phillips, and she talked about fourth sector. And fourth sector, she means private enterprise that actually is for the community, that's for benefit. So it's not third sector because it's not non-profit, but it's private enterprise for the community. And the person who originally did it mortgaged her own house to set up this broadband connection, and later became fibre optic, which means that this village is one of the best connected in the whole of Scotland. And then it was later she moved away, and it was turned into a worker cooperative. It has a number of lively community websites and many social enterprises that are facilitated through this kind of online connection. So what are the major findings? Well, the common factors are, for these broadband initiatives to work, you have to have a variety of things available in the community, and this is why it doesn't work in most communities. It works only in some of them. So the first thing is, human capital. You have to have these community entrepreneurs. I'm sorry about the vocabulary, but they are people who are just good at being community leaders, and they mobilise people. And being a community leader is a very different role from being, say, a business leader, because their job is they have to have networks outside the community to know how to get the funding, and they have to have networks inside the community in such a way that people trust them and they can actually get things moving. So in the more successful examples, there were a number of community entrepreneurs, a number of people who were able to mobilise those kinds of resources. In the more fragile examples that I mentioned, there was only one person. And when there's only one person, then it depends a lot on that one person, and then they get burnt out or they move. The whole initiative collapses. It also depends on technological capital of various kinds, and here quite often a connection with the university has been quite important. Some of these have been co-funded by universities. So the island community was co-funded by Edinburgh University, for example, because there was a professor from Edinburgh who moved there. So there was kind of, these personal connections were also important, but he had the kind of expertise, the knowledge, which enabled that to happen. In the commuter village, it was an engineer who did it as part of his job, so he had the expertise, the knowledge to make that kind of initiative work. And there's social capital, of course. Having the knowledge isn't enough unless you can link it with other things. So being able to mobilise networks inside the community so that people become part of this initiative. It becomes a participative initiative rather than just one person. And also being able to mobilise networks outside the community, knowing who to go to get permissions and where to get funding. We added another one here, identity capital, because this was quite important. So people having an interest in their community. So the fact that they thought it was a nice place and they wanted to make it a better place was also important. That kind of community mobilisation was important for people having a sort of identification with the place. And the broadband was also a way of making those places more interesting for people. So they had various historical organisations or various community events that they could look at. They could advertise online as well. And finally, financial capital, but usually this was a question of knowing where funding was taking place, knowing how to access that wind farm funding, for example, or knowing how to access the EU LEADER funding, which was quite critical in all of these initiatives. And then there's questions of sustainability. How sustainable are these projects? Well, there's several threats to them, basically. First of all, the structure of the projects themselves, because sometimes when they're just depending on one person or one initiative, or they can't keep going. And the structures of funding, because the funding tends to be project-based. You get a sort of tranche of funding, then it goes, then they've got to apply for another tranche of funding, there might be a gap in between, and that's why you get this ebbing and fluxing all the time of these kinds of community initiatives, and why a lot of them break down, because they haven't got a continuity of funding, they have to keep applying and may not succeed the next time. And the failure of success, so what I call the failure of success. So where these community broadband initiatives were very successful, like in the commuter village, BT comes along and says, oh, in that case, we'll provide it. Or you can see there's a market now, we'll provide it. So they get taken over by bigger companies with much bigger capacity, and therefore the local initiative just kind of breaks down because there's no point to it anymore. So there's an issue about how sustainable those structures are, but also what other kinds of activities they might lead to. So technology gets used in different ways by different communities and different community members. I think Helen's talked about that. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here, but we've written several papers about it. So geographical communities, just because it's a community doesn't mean it's homogenous. You've got all different kind of fractions within the community that are using technology in very different ways. Community broadband initiatives do mobilise and stimulate community empowerment, but they have certain limitations, which I hope I've pointed out. You need to have the right combination of circumstances to take advantage of those opportunities. So some places manage to do it, other places just don't. How sustainable are these initiatives? I'm not sure, because as I say, as broadband gets rolled out, there may be other for-profit providers more likely to take over those kinds of things over from the non-profit community initiatives. Does community broadband lead to other things? Well, you can see in some of those communities it did lead to sort of more cohesion and more activity within the community as a community, but in other places it just didn't. So it doesn't mean that if you provide technology, you necessarily know what's going to happen. It might make lives better and it might not. It might just mean people continue the sort of lives they had before. So you need to not just set up ICT access, but also use it creatively for community development. So I think that's where, as well, I'm a sociologist, the sociologists and also many people here would have an important part to play in saying, well, actually, how would you use this ICT and how would you make it available to wider members of the community, not just assuming that they're going to, that if you access the community, you then access everybody. No, you don't. You've got different types of people in the community and different ways in which they're online or offline. So this is based on a whole series of research projects, and I've got a little film I did of one of these communities, also a blog that I do some summaries of this work, and a website where you can find the papers and things that we wrote about it. Thank you very much.
This plenary is about communities, academic research and impact, and I want to talk a little about an innovation which has been led by the EPSRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, particularly focused on two of those, communities and academic research. And it's a programme that I'm fortunate enough to have a central role in, and it's called Connected Communities.